As I look over this audience, I don't see a lot of people who look like me. In other words, you don't have bald heads. So this thing that I do, it's a little crazy. I find slave dwellings wherever they exist, and I ask the owners if I could spend the night in these spaces. It's a little odd, yes, but I do this because of the connections that can be made through these slave dwellings. Yes, we are connected. Although I said most of you don't look like me, we are connected, and I could take you through this. I could show you how we are connected. For the African Americans, it's a little difficult for us to find our roots, to prove our history, to prove that we were more than enslaved people. But in order to do that, sometimes we have to go to those places that some of our heroes or perceived heroes were, the places that they occupied. And sometimes we have to use science to prove that connection. Archaeology is one of those sciences. I've gone to Montpelier. That's the home of our President James Madison, the father of our Constitution. You know, we the people, but should have read we the people, comma, in this room. Because if you weren't in that room, it meant nothing to you. But I go there anyway to make those connections. By the way, President James Madison died on this day, June 28th, in 1836. So I guess it's quite appropriate that we should be having this conversation right about now. But the thing about President James Madison is while he lived in that nice, beautiful house, that architecturally significant house that we as Americans like to preserve and interpret, the people who I share my DNA with lived in the slave cabins. While President James Madison and First Lady Dolly Madison and all of their children were considered one whole person, the folks who I derived my DNA from were considered 3/5. So it is a little painful to go and think about those things and think about our founding fathers in that manner. But with this thing that I do, the slave dwelling project, and going around and sleeping in these places, I get to interact with these places. And it's because the archaeology that's being done at this site that they're placing the slave dwellings back on the landscape. So when you go back there now, if you ever visited there before, when you go back, you're going to see that those slave dwellings are there. So as you look at that nice, beautiful mansion that President James Madison and Dolly Madison occupied, in your periphery to the right, you're going to see those slave dwellings. So you can't ignore that part of history anymore. So in this travel, in this thing that I do, I go to these sites because when we think about our former presidents, we have to realize that 12 of our former presidents were slave owners, 8 of whom owned slaves while they were in office. So I get to go to Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. You know Thomas Jefferson, unalienable rights, all men are created equal. Well, Thomas Jefferson owned 600 people. And another science that connects us to the past is DNA. You know, a lot of folks are doing their DNA. For African Americans, doing DNA is a difficult task because it depended on the records that the plantation owners kept. Now, if you think about these enslaved people as property, then it's easier to do the research. Because if you're looking for names, it's very seldom that you're going to find a name. Even if you look at the 1850 census or the 1860 census, you're not going to find a name. You'll find them listed. You'll find them enumerated. They'll give them a gender, an age, and a race for the purpose of paying taxes on them or for the purpose of congressional representation. But that's about all you're going to get. So I thought that if I go to these places and apply what I do, then they'll realize that the stories that they've been telling for so long have not been complete. Because we want to stay in a comfort zone that does not honor the people who were enslaved, the people who I derive my DNA from. So lately, we've been going around and sleeping around, if you will, at some of these sites, and we've been having a real good time. We've been having those conversations about Confederate monuments. You know, most recently, there's that debate. I mean, it's back in the forefront. You know, New Orleans, they just removed some Confederate monuments from the city. And, you know, I don't know if that's good or bad. The jury is kind of still out on that because, you know, once we make those connections to our history, you know, the bad parts of it we try to get rid of or sweep under the rug. But now that New Orleans has removed those Confederate monuments, we have to figure out where in this slippery slope do we stop? Because now that New Orleans has removed those Confederate monuments because it reminds us of slavery and white supremacy, then you got to remember that these Confederate generals had a father. So what was passed down to them came from their father. And they got it from their fathers. So where do we disconnect? Where do we stop? When do we stop moving these monuments off the landscape? You know, this attempt years ago, they tried to remove the N-word out of Huckleberry Finn. Same concept. Why are we trying to clean it up? You know, we cannot remove the monuments and control what happened in the past. It's history. Let it happen. Let's talk about it. So that's what this project does. We get to go to these places and we have those discussions. You know, those discussions about Black Lives Matter. Well, why does Black Lives Matter? Because we have to think about those things that replace slavery. You know, convict labor and black codes and Jim Crow laws and redlining. So we got to put all those things together. And when we go to these places, we have these conversations. So I also get to go to these institutions of higher learning, like Clemson University. Clemson University is where my daughter now attends, but every time I have to write a check, every year I write that check, and I think about Ben Tillman, and I think about John C. Calhoun, you know, the great nullifier. And when we think about these institutions of higher learning, we got to think about the Harvards and the Yales. You know, when Harvard discovered that Isaac Royall Jr., one of its founders, was associated with the institution of slavery, their reaction was to remove that symbol off of their shield. I think that's wrong. Why disassociate yourself from that institution? You have to own that. You have to be responsible for that past. And Yale removes the name of John C. Calhoun from some of his buildings. Don't do that. Give us the opportunity to have the conversation about the folks who found this nation. Let us know that, yes, we are a great nation today, but we are a nation with flaws. And eventually, if we continue to remove ourselves from the bad parts of history, and we don't know where to stop, we got to think about Washington, D.C. How would Washington, D.C. look without a Washington Monument or a Jefferson Memorial? Because these men, too, were slave owners. Of course, right now we're in South Dakota, the great state of South Dakota. How would Mount Rushmore look without Jefferson or Washington? You know, if we use that same concept of trying to remove ourselves from white supremacy and these slave owners, we got to think about these things, folks. So I get to go to these places, and we use these places as classrooms. You know, I recall that I went to Belgrove Plantation in Middletown, Virginia. A group from Pennsylvania, Bloomsburg College in Pennsylvania, wanted to come and have that experience. And I said, well, look, we don't have to travel that far. You know, the state of Pennsylvania, they had slavery in that state also. You know, slavery ended in Pennsylvania in 1780. But, you know, they had this rule on the books. They were playing the shell game. Because if you held an enslaved person or enslaved people for 6 months, that means you had to free them. So in this shell game that they played, they would hold them for 5 months and some change, and then send them back south. They bring in a new batch and start the cycle all over. Even our President George Washington engaged in that practice. So in this thing, slave dwelling project, in sleeping around, in sleeping in these places, we get the opportunity to have those discussions, to make those connections to our past. Not only do we make those connections to the past, we get to have those discussions and we get to move on from there. And everybody can become ambassadors for these buildings, knowing that we have to keep these buildings on the landscape. Because it's not always about the nice, architecturally significant big house. It's the rest of the story that these other places are capable of telling. And I don't mind going and inserting myself in their interpretation to make sure that they're telling the whole story, not just part of the story, not just that part of the story that makes us feel good as people. Because when we visit these presidential sites, we got to be able to tell the whole story. Now, I thought about my visit to the Hermitage, Nashville, Tennessee, the home of President Andrew Jackson. Yes, it was good that you did all that you did in the War of 1812 and came out victorious. But New Orleans, now that you've removed those statues of the Confederacy, what are you going to do about Jackson Square? Because when you think about why we remove monuments, it's because it's something in the past that we didn't agree with. And I don't agree with the Trail of Tears. So what are we going to do now, New Orleans, now that we've started this process? So we have to tell the whole story. We have to do these things. We have to do these things that we do now. We go to these sites. We sleep in these sites. And the next morning, we get up, we don our period outfits, and we have these demonstrations. We have these living history sessions that we do. And then these living history sessions that we do, we have these cooking demonstrations. We have these blacksmithing demonstrations. We intersperse this with stories. And the stories they aren't pleasant because slavery was not a pleasant thing. But we do these things. We give folks the opportunity to come and indulge and learn the real history, not the sugar-coated, watered-down, gone with the wind, hoop-skirt, mid-jeweler version of the story. We tell the real stories, the raw stories. So that's what this allows us to do. So when we put the archaeology together with the genealogy, and we start entering this genealogical information, we find out things about ourselves that sometimes we're not prepared to handle. You know, like Thomas Jefferson, the fact that the DNA has proven that he had children with Sally Hemings, the half-sister of his wife. And we go there and we have these conversations around the campfire. Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, consensual or not. Keep in mind, she was only 14 at the time. So these opportunities at these sites, they give us the opportunity to explore these things. So when we put the archaeology with the genealogy and throw in that DNA, we can have these conversations. So what can you do to help? How can you assist in this? Well, there are lots of ways you can do that. You need to visit these sites. Like tomorrow, I'm going to Mount Rushmore, and I'm going to really enjoy it. And I may have to, do one of these, maybe kind of blot out Jefferson and Washington. But so you got to think about those things. You got to think about those things when we try to pretty up our past. It's not always the best route to go. So I want you to visit these places. I might be asking too much if I ask you to spend the night in these spaces with me, because everybody can't handle that. I've given people invitations. They say, yes, I'll be there, and I'm there waiting, twiddling my thumbs, waiting for these folks, and they never show. For various reasons, they never show. But the thing is, we have the opportunity, we give you the opportunity to come and explore these places with us. And if you have the courage, if you want to sleep in one of these places with us in the future, you're more than welcome. These places are important. These places where the enslaved people occupied are important, whether they exist today as a garage or storage space or a pool house or a rental space or an office. They still exist, and we should help allow them to exist. They should be preserved, they should be interpreted, they should be maintained, and they should be sustained. And you can help us do that. Thank you.